Thank you very much for being here to attend the last paper of the morning. Thank you to the organizer for the opportunity to present this case study. Of course, I work for the Bank of Italy, so usual disclaimers applies, and I have co-authored this paper with many other colleagues working at the Bank of Italy in the Human Research Department. So what we do here is try to estimate the so-called child penalty within the Bank of Italy. Motherhood, we know, is something that has been identified as the main cause of gender differences in the labor market since the 80s, since the seminal work of Becker, but many other studies and recent ones have shown that the so-called child penalty, that is the penalization of women in the labor market after the birth of their first child, are widespread. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and that affect both labor supply of women and earnings. And another particular feature of this child penalty that is common to many economies is that this is rather persistent. So we have thought that it could have been interesting for us to understand what happens to a single institution, also because of looking at single institutions can have a lot of benefits in order to better measure the penalty, because of people are subject to the same rules, workers are subject to the same rules also for promotion and so on, and because you can also try to experiment some policies in order to attenuate, to reduce this penalty. This has relevant consequences for human resources, and so we have tried to do this. By the use of Bank of Italy personal data, we look at a panel of workers, both men and women, and we estimate the child penalty by comparing fathers versus mothers, and we outline the role of the main determinants of the child penalty that we find. And we distinguish also by cohort in order to identify changes in rules that can have potentially modified the penalty. And then we check, as I mentioned, the potential impact of some policies, some changes in rules that have occurred during the most recent years. Some preview of the main results. We find a significant penalty within the bank in hours worked, more or less 10% hours less after 15 years from the birth of the first child by mother compared to fathers. There are also significant penalties in earnings that become large, especially after 6 years from the birth of the first child. They are mainly driven by hours worked, the differences in hours worked, and faster career progression of men. And then, given these not very encouraging results, we have tried to dig deeper in our analysis by distinguishing between cohorts. And we run all our exercises again for two different cohorts of women, that is those hired between 1996 and 2000, and those hired afterwards, that is from 10 years afterwards. And we focus on the second group because the second group has been subject to some relevant policy changes that have probably influenced also their behavior and the behavior of fathers. And we look at three specific channels of the reduction in the child penalty that we find for younger women. The first, nothing new in terms of policies. We find that offering nursery services for workers improves hours worked by mothers, we find that if you increase fathers' leave provisions, then mothers work more. Nothing special, nothing new, but important within an institution in order to draw conclusion to draw conclusion about the policies that a human resource management can do. And then we find that also new rules for promotion that have been implemented during the period for other reasons, however, have had a positive impact on the child penalty. We cannot say that all this stuff explains the child penalty. We cannot assess the relevant contribution of each channel. This is mainly a descriptive paper, but we find that going in this direction can be useful. So the data. We have a panel, or more or less 40,000 observations. We use many observations in different years, but the main analyses are carried out from the 1996 to 2019. And we exclude those who leave the bank because they decide to work outside or just because they retire, and we end up with more or less 4,000 observations. And we have data on hours work in full-time equivalent term, annual earnings, also by type, that is base wage, variable wage, compensation when workers work outside the bank, and so on. Of course, we also have some relevant information like the number of children and the exact date in which a children is born. And for some workers, that is, those are couples within the bank, we observe also the identifier of the other component of the couple. Of course, there are privacy issues, and so everything has been fully anonymized in order to ensure everything, and the access is particularly restricted, as you can imagine. So, again, a descriptive paper, but I would like to convince you that child penalty is relevant just by comparing people, men and women, with and without children. This is the difference in earnings. The pink line is the difference among men and women with children in earnings, while the blue line, women minus men without children. And as you can see, the larger gap is driven by mothers with children, as expected. So we observe the number of children at age 45, so we take into account all possible end of the fertility life, so this is realized fertility, and this is the main motivation of our work. And this is the child penalty in hours. For those who are expert in labor economics, this is standard. Also, if you look at within an institution, what you find is a drop at age 0 of your first child, the shaded vertical line. This drop then, of course, decreases over time, but it is persistent, and as mentioned before, also after 15 years from the birth of the first child, mothers work less than fathers. Typically, this literature focuses on the first child because the second and third are endogenous, but of course also the decision to have a first child is endogenous. As I mentioned, this is just descriptive. Here I would like to mention that since the majority of men and women at the Bank of Italy are married, we are comparing mothers versus fathers. And here the gap in earnings, unconditional, and this is rather bad, right? Because before the birth of the first child, earnings are more or less equal between mothers and fathers, and then they drop, and then remain low and low and low even after 15, 20 years from the birth of the first child. So unconditional on other characteristics, this drop remains there. The only thing that is positive is that it is remarkably lower than Italy, the Italian labor market on average, since it amounts to 20% gap in earnings, whereas in Italy we have a 60% drop in earnings in labor market as a whole. So that is an enormous amount of penalty. So now we would like to describe what are the determinants of this penalty, and then these are the past figure was about annual earnings. Here we introduce controls, so that is we control for hours worked, and we control also for the hierarchical position of men and women, fathers and mothers. And again, the zero line is the time of the birth of the first child. And if you control for hours, as in the blue line, then you see a spike, a positive spike when the child is born, and this depends on the fact that we have compulsory parental leave in Italy, so mothers are in some sense forced to stay at home for more or less 5 months, so they work less, but they are still fully compensated for this, of course. And this implies that at that time, at the time of the birth of the first child, the gap is positive, but then it rapidly declines. And compared to the previous figure, what we find is that when we control for hours, then we find that the difference, the gap in hours, is important in explaining the child penalty. But if we also include the hierarchical level of the mother at the time we are going to measure the gap, then we find that promotions in the middle career help to explain a very, very high part of the remaining penalty. Still, a small part of the penalty remains, but supply hours worked and promotion are the main thing there. Again, by controlling for hours and hours and the hierarchy, we also look at the different wage components, and we find that is base wage, variable wage, and what we call mission, that is compensation for working outside the bank, business trips and so on. And what we find is that base wages are more or less similar after you control for hours and hierarchy, but the remaining gap is mainly driven by variable compensation and missions, which is rather obvious, right? It is well known that typically mothers tend to travel less than fathers because of childcare and so on. I would like to stress, however, that concerning variable compensation at the Bank of Italy, variable compensation is in part related to performance, but is also in part related to disadvantage time, working time, like shifts and so on. So it's not necessarily linked to performance of workers. So from these additional pay components, we get the remaining gap. Then, as mentioned before, we run the same regression, same story for these two cohorts, older women and younger women. These are hours. And this is amazing. This is an amazing result because we find that the child penalty is still there, and is in hours worked, of course, and is related to motherhood, clearly, but younger women were able to close the gap, and this is extremely encouraging for our human resources, at least in terms of hours. So the hours gap closes after 6-7 years from the birth of the first child. That is when the woman has already had also the second child. And here is the difference in earnings by cohort. Once again, one younger cohort perform better. There is still some gap there. And of course, if we look at the younger cohort, we do not know what happens after 20 years, right? Because children are still younger for them. And but still we can see some encouraging signal also on that side. So family friendly policies probably matter. And here, what we do is to analyze our data set in order to understand whether the opening of a new childcare nursery in Rome Center has helped the mothers to work more. The exercise is very simple. Okay, the exercise is very simple. We compare mothers working. Rome is a very big city, and the bank have many buildings located in very different parts of the city. And there are women that work of course, workers work everywhere. But in 2009, a new nursery has been opened in a specific building, and what we do is to compare hours worked of workers before and after the opening of the new nursery located in the city center, by controlling also for where the workers work. And what we find in a sort of spurious diff comparison is that, of course, with the opening of the new nursery, workers in the city center increased their use of nursery services provided by the bank, and with similar intensity between men and women. But a nursery for women after 2008 implies also longer time spent at work. That is a reduction in the gap with respect to fathers. I go faster, promise. The second thing is that father's leave. Father's leave have been improved in Italy from 2012 to 2015, and especially those of unpaid leave for children from 6 to 12 years of age. And again, what we find is that if the father takes leaves, unpaid leaves for older children, then the mother works more with an elasticity equal to 1. And last, the reform of promotion rules, so which is in some sense similar. The findings are similar to those of Anne and Laura for ECB. In 2017, the bank had decided to change the way in which promotion occur. So, moving from a competitive exam, a competitive blind exam, to commissions. That is, committees that decide promotions, and they are composed by managers. Of course, there is this literature that says that women typically self-exclude themselves from competition, from exams, and so on. And what we find is that after this reform, the probability that a mother, the probability of promotion of mothers with respect to fathers after the reform has increased considerably. These are probit estimates, and these are marginal effects. I stop here, thank you, and I have no conclusions since it's rather obvious. The only thing that I would like to stress is that our next step is to try to understand how remote working after the pandemic has affected the hours wage gap. Thank you.
Welcome, Carlos. I would only make the conclusion it should be the mother penalty, not the child penalty, right? Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, the organizers, for giving me the chance to discuss this paper. So I will provide first a quick summary. So the paper studies an important research question, which is the child penalty at the Bank of Italy. And importantly, it provides some evidence on the mechanisms. As to the methods and data, the authors use an event study in the spirit of Clair et al. And use administrative data from the Bank of Italy. And a quick review of the results. So they find a lower child penalty than in the broader Italian labor market. Also, a lower child penalty for younger cohorts of women. And they, importantly, as I said, they can provide some evidence on the mechanisms, and they provide some evidence that this is driven it's driven by the provision of childcare and by a revision of career progression rules. And interestingly, they have data from couples, so where both members of the couple work at the Bank of Italy. And they find that with this data, they provide evidence that parental leave for parents boosts women's hours and earnings. So overall, the paper addresses a key research question, and as I said, I especially liked the fact that they can provide some evidence on the mechanisms. The paper uses high-quality data, large sample size, administrative data. It studies a homogeneous high education sample. And I think what is very interesting here is that, as I said, they had data for couples where both members are working for the Bank of Italy. And I think this is something that you could play up a bit in the motivation of the paper. So now, the rest of my discussion, I will provide some comments. So first of all, regarding like the main analysis of the child penalty, I mean, it wasn't entirely clear to me what exactly what regression exactly you were considering. So I would recommend first showing the estimating equations, and then being clear about how and why what you are doing differs from the standard practice to estimate the child penalty from Kleven et al. So, for example, two things. I noticed that the graphs are not normalized. The effect is not normalized to be zero at time zero. Also, I noticed you include individual fixed effects. Well, here, like the strategy should include age, calendar time interactions, and event time binary variables. So the idea is that the age dummies control non-parametrically for latent life cycle trends, and the year and month dummies control for business cycle effects. So yeah, overall, I think more clarity as to why what we are doing would be great. And another my main comments is that some of the controls that you use throughout the paper, I think they could be endogenous controls. So, for example, you control for hours worked throughout the paper, for hierarchy, or for father's parental leave, while it's the case that fathers and mothers' hours may be jointly determined. I think this also applies to the fact to you're excluding workers on temporary leave. So I think it's problematic to include all these variables as controls, as given that they could be affected by the treatment by having a child. So I would recommend dropping them as controls, and instead consider these variables as outcomes. Also note that we cannot say that the conditional comparison once you are controlling for these things captures the part of the effect that is not explained by the other variable. In fact, the conditional comparison does not tell us much that is useful without a more elaborate model. And finally, just to conclude, some more specific comments. So for the cohort analysis that you do, that is very interesting. I would suggest showing the results for all periods of time. I mean, I know there can be some power issues, but still it would be worth exploring, not just for the two periods 1996-2000 and 2006-2010, but like more the period in between and more disaggregated by year. And you could show, as I said, the effect by year and test whether there are also whether there are significant differences by year. Regarding the magnitude of the effects, I think it would be helpful to more systematically compare the child penalty that you find to those in other Italian sectors and in other countries as well. You mentioned that it's lower than for the overall Italian population, but it would be helpful to know how it compares to other highly educated sectors in the Italian population or in other countries. Perhaps even a table may be useful. And finally, I also missed like some discussion on the precision of the estimate, some measure of standard errors. But as I said, a very interesting paper. Thanks a lot.
There's one question right at the back there. We'll take a couple.
So thank you for the paper, and very interested in the data sampled as well that you have. So with that respect and respecting the anonymity, can you divide them out into different types of work groups or job profiles, because in some cases the way your performance and your promotions are recognized depends on the type of output. So similar work on the child penalty in academia showed that actually somehow the fathers or the non-birth giving parents, even though they pause their tenure clock, they recoup that really quickly, because the mothers are on parental leave and the fathers are on sabbatical. Like, they're still doing their research and they're still publishing while they're taking care of their child. So I don't know if they're similar within your institution, where the types of output or the types of job you have, you can actually continue to produce while you're on leave.
Okay.
Thank you for a very interesting paper. I just had one question about the data. So you mentioned that you excluded those who left the bank, which I thought made a lot of sense. But you also mentioned that you excluded those who retired. And I wondered if that might have some sort of selection bias implication, because I imagine that that would kind of give us some inference, I suppose, in terms of the lifespan of their careers. And I did notice that in most of the figures that you showed, there was an uptick from the 20-year mark. So if we were able to see maybe these women, after many years working in this sector, kind of improve, or there's a convergence, that would be important to see. So I wondered why that was excluded.
I actually want to follow up in Tamara's question. So can you do the same exercise for the fathers and see if there is indeed a child penalty for fathers as well? Because there is a study actually which has been done in academia. It actually showed the exact opposite, that the fathers actually do perform much better after their first child. So it will be interesting to see indeed if this is a child penalty or if it's a mother penalty, and it could be potentially a child advantage for the fathers.
That was sort of mine.
Thank you, really interesting paper. I was wondering if you can look at promotion subject to shorter hours or controlling for shorter hours, because shorter hours may be a choice, and should we not be promoting part-time working? And what effect does that have on promotion?
Okay. We'll take one more, and then I think we're a little behind schedule, so we should probably...
My question is actually very much related to the very last one. If you can see like a switch from an open-ended contract, a full-time contract to a part-time. So that could probably explain the drop if they decided to switch type of contract.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the technical suggestions. Just a quick comment, but maybe we can on technical issue we can discuss later. Yes, we just use fixed effect just to control for unobserved heterogeneity within workers, since we find that indeed there are differences in the choice of hours. We do not control as in standard literature, because we are less worried about it other heterogeneities during the life cycles, because more or less all workers enter at the same age, have children after some years, and so on. This is a specific group of workers that do not worry us too much in this consideration. We have dropped those who leave. Just I have to confess for convenience, nothing more. Just because there are some workers that go and come back, and so it's rather difficult to follow them. Also because when they come back, there are different rules in order to put them in their hierarchical position. It was a mess, and so we have dropped. Father's premium, we find something there, in the sense that we find that we haven't investigated it too much, also because this is the first time that I present this paper. It was a rush. Thank you very much for your comments. But we find indeed that father increased their hours after the first child birth, and this is something that is extremely important to investigate. We have to think about this. And what about hours and shift from part-time to full-time? Well, what we find in promotion is that promotion are extremely influenced by total hours worked. I haven't discussed that result much, but we accumulate all the hours worked in the 7 years before the promotion, and we find that the coefficient is very large and significant. So at the end of the day, how the time you spend at work matters considerably. And yeah, the type of job, last question, the type of job is extremely important too. This is something we haven't investigated. It's an important, we also because there are shifts in the type of job that a worker do in his her career. So this is something that is unexplored. So thank you for this comment. This is very important. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the presenters and discussants. Three very interesting papers. So.